Welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, we are discussing the top conservation issues relevant to hunters and anglers to keep an eye on in 2026. And I'm joined by Devin O.D. and Chris Borgatti of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast. And welcome to the new year. It should be January 1st, I believe, or right around that when this podcast first drops. So happy new year. Welcome to 2026. And today's conversation is going to be all about looking forward into this new year and some of the key issues, challenges, and opportunities that we should be aware of and keeping an eye on related to hunting and fishing and wildlife and wild places, the things that we need to keep doing the things that we love. What do we need to keep tabs on? What do we need to be engaging in? There was so much going on in 2025. There were so many headlines. There were so many social media posts and podcasts and on and on and on, right? You were inundated by it. I was inundated by it. What's the new year going to look like? That's what I want to discuss today and kind of do it in a little bit more of a general way. Our two guests today come from Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. They are the Western Policy and Conservation Manager and the Eastern Policy and Conservation Manager for Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. On the western end is Devin O.D. On the eastern side is Chris Borgatti. And, rather than working in Washington, D.C., they are primarily working at the local level, on the state level, working with fish and game commissions and agencies and state houses and legislatures and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, with the grassroots membership spread out across the nation. And so I reached out to them and just asked them to come to the table today with some high-level sets of kind of issues or key focus areas when it comes to what might be in store for 2026, what we as hunters and anglers can influence in 2026. So we're not going to be talking about like some specific mine or some specific piece of legislation that we need to fight against or support. This is a little bit more general. We speak about, I'm kind of stealing a little bit of the thunder here, but I'm going to tell you what the four main categories are that we're going to get into. We're going to discuss key things to understand about conservation funding in 2026, key things to understand about public land management, key things on the access to lands and waters, and then finally, some interesting things going on related to wildlife crossings, fish crossings, connecting wildlife habitat of all types. Those are the four kind of overarching categories that we're going to discuss. Chris and Devin help us do that. And a really important thing that I think we discuss here, and that's, I think, hopefully going to be continued to address throughout this entire year and year after year after year, is not just what's going on out there, but really what can we do? How do we as an average everyday American hunter and angler actually influence change? How do we impact things? How do we make sure we are educated enough to take action and know what to do that leads to healthy wildlife populations, healthy fish populations, access to healthy, accessible public lands or quality private lands, having the opportunities to go out there and do these things that we love so much? That's a big part of what we discuss too, is how do you actually influence change? How do you actually engage with your state agency or your senator's office or your state representative, your National Forest Planning Committee, whatever it is? We discussed that. I think it's really important. I think it will be useful. And that is how I want us to kick off this new year, is thinking about how we can make things better. Because we all have that opportunity. We all can make a difference. But it does take us choosing to do so and then putting in that work to make it happen. So I'm very excited that 2026 is here, that we get to kick things off in this kind of way. I'm excited that you are here with us. I appreciate it. So without any further ado, let's get to my chat with Chris Borgatti and Devin O.D. from Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. All right, with me now on the line is Devin O.D. and Chris Borgatti of BHA. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. I'm excited because when this episode drops, it will be the new year. It will be 2026. The first day of the new year is the scheduled date for this to go live. And we've just come off of a pretty crazy 12 months, pretty tumultuous, pretty headline grabbing year when it comes to the things that the three of us care about. I think most of our listeners too. Wildlife, wild places, hunting and fishing opportunities and access, public lands, all the above. How are you guys personally feeling coming off of a year like this? Maybe you can kick us off, Chris. I got to believe that working in the conservation sector, working in this line of business has been a wild ride.
It definitely has. If it wasn't for the fact that the hunting season eventually did come around, I would be completely spent and exhausted because I was pretty much there when September hit. So to get back in the woods, to get up in a tree, to get the duck boat situated, all of those things was the sort of hey, this is why you do this. This is why we've been going at a frenetic pace since January, and it came at the right time. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. What about you, Devin?
I think an important disclaimer here is Chris and I just both got off of our backcountry weeks last week. So BHA has a policy where you get an extra week of PTO as long as you use it for hunting and fishing 5 days in a row. So
that's pretty great.
We both, are coming off that one. So I'd say we're riding high, also spending some time in a tree, shooting some ducks. And, if it wasn't for that, if you'd asked me a week prior, I probably would have, not had the same bright outlook or been as cheery after getting revamped from public lands. But yeah, it was quite, I would say tumultuous, just overwhelming at times. But, I think when you get a chance to get back out and realize why you're doing it and the importance of it all, it kind of quickly fades away and gets you recharged and reset for another year.
Yeah, thank goodness for the outside. It is the ultimate rejuvenator. No doubt about that. So when you look forward to 2026, do you have a sense? Do you have any kind of prediction? Is this going to be a repeat of 2025 with all the things we just discussed? Or do you sense that maybe things will settle down and that you guys will be able to get some sleep again and the rest of us can kick back and get fat and sassy again? What do you think on that front, Devin?
I don't think it's possible to repeat this year. I think it's going to look a lot different next year. I think things will settle in a little bit politically. At the state level, it's always kind of a crapshoot. That stuff seems to just kind of pop up all over the place, and there's just so many different bills to wade through. But I would say we're gonna likely see some of the same themes, but maybe some of those themes sort of evolving, understanding, how things like, the big elephant in the room, the public land sales from this summer, and BHA's, United We Stand campaign, United We Stand for Public Lands. I think we're going to see, BHA is definitely going to keep moving that forward. We're going to double down there, but I don't think we're going to see another Senator Lee attempt to sell 3 million acres during budget reconciliation. That being said, I think that will evolve and it'll be popping up in different areas in different ways, potentially with, looking at land transfers or looking at smaller parcels, the resource management planning process. And I think we're gonna see, maybe not on the same type of broad scale, but similar threats and really important areas for hunters and anglers to stay engaged in the political process.
Okay. What about you, Chris? On your side there, what do you sense coming down the line?
Well, there are some things that aren't settled yet that we really, had some serious call to actions on last year that, the administration will be sort of finalizing their position after sorting through public comment and things like that. So we're going to be dealing with some of that stuff again. So that's not completely settled for sure. But I will say that the silver lining, at least at the state level, often that we've seen in a bunch of different places, is that state legislatures and state officials, they kind of want to push back a little bit on some of the more sort of things we've kind of lost, or at least the feeling of having lost control of certain things. So that said, I think there's a willingness to sort of tackle tough issues at the local level, we saw some of that last year, and I think we'll continue to see that in this new year as well. So, in that respect, I think we're going to have some good opportunities to make some really positive impacts at the state level.
Okay, that's encouraging. And maybe that's a perfect place for us to kind of jump to next, which is, some specifics. What I really wanted to hopefully cover here is specific either threats coming in the next year or opportunities coming the next year that hunters and anglers should be watching for, should be paying attention to, should be ready to take action on. Because I think one of the most important, one of the greatest overarching, I think, threats or challenges that we face is just people who care about wildlife and wild places and these opportunities and these resources is the perpetual looming cloud of bad stuff going on, and we as individuals feeling like we don't have any power or any influence over them, right? There's always this threat of that kind of feeling of apathy or helplessness to seep in. But the antidote to that, I think, is always action. It's like, what can I do? How can I somehow be involved? How can I do a little bit today or next month or anything like that? That seems to be like this little bit of magic that if you can access that, it can change, not only change things on the ground, but just change things like in your head. At least personally, I found that to be the case. So what I'm really hoping we can achieve here is to understand what's coming, but then also understand now what? Like, what does that mean for me listening? How do I do something about one of these things or four of these things or whatever it is? So to kind of preview where I'm hoping we can go, that's kind of how I want to approach all this. So when I say all that, Chris, and maybe we can kind of go back and forth. I might just kind of pitch it to you, Chris, and then you, Devin, and we can kind of go back and forth. And each of you can share with me and us a handful of those top issues or opportunities coming down the line that are top of mind for you, and then that should be top of mind for just hunters and anglers across the nation. So, Chris, what's the first thing that you would say that we need to be ready for, watching for, and paying attention to?
I think one that really provides is sort of something we have to pay attention to, but it's also a real opportunity, is related to conservation funding. And when I say that's pretty high level. So I'm talking about conservation funding at sort of the just overall state level in terms of what might be used for land management or land acquisition, but also for our state fish and game agencies. A lot of state fish and game agencies are really in a tight spot in terms of budgeting, and there's a lot of opportunities there that we as hunters and anglers, as the main constituents for these agencies, have to really kind of step up and be a constructive voice around. Sometimes it comes in the form of changes in license fees. There's a lot of state agencies that haven't reckoned with that change in many years. Others are trying to find new and different avenues to create new funding streams. The one thing we have to keep in mind is, I think, is the fact that just operating costs have steadily increased for state agencies. Pensions or health insurance, all of these things that they have to provide for their employees, like those have increased dramatically over the years. And that's just the keep the doors open kind of costs, right? That's not even like money on the ground, putting people where they need to be, managing wildlife habitat, all of these things. So I think that is a really big issue from the agency level to the state level. And there is some connectivity to the federal funding, and I think a lot of the states are just trying to find ways to be to sort of ride any future inconsistencies in funding streams. So it's a good opportunity there, and there are some creative ways that are being proposed. Some kind of controversial, like for the like in the for instance, having like access fees paid for non-hunting and angling members of the community to access state lands, for instance. Whereas there are other sort of less controversial ones where we've got these data centers, for instance, popping up all over the country. Could there be a nexus found in terms of conservation and like a small tax levied on energy use or land area use that could be generated from these data center operators? And there's a couple efforts around the country to do just that. So there are opportunities, but again, it's going to take our community being engaged and understanding the challenges the state agencies are facing.
Have you guys heard, if either one of you heard, if there's any movement on Recovering America's Wildlife Act? If that's something that's going to get reintroduced? I know I've heard rumors of it. I've heard talk that they want to, but do we have any sense of where that actually stands right now? And for folks that aren't familiar, could one of you explain what that is and what that could do if it ever passed?
I want to say that a couple months ago, I had a colleague or a partner mention that they thought RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, still had, a really strong chance and was something that, they were really wanted to put resources into. And that was something that gave me optimism, that there is very much hope there for that particular legislation. Chris and I both work more on the state level. So we're not, we're one step removed from what's happening, in DC and kind of where a lot of those conversations are on reintroduction and how people are sort of posturing there. But, I'd say we're definitely optimistic. It's a really critical bill that, directs a significant amount of funding to state and tribes, state agencies, tribes, to basically keep endangered species kind of out of the emergency room. And so you've got, threatened and endangered species, and that is a big part of that funding, but there are so many layers there to conservation benefits in RAWA that impact fish and game species that we all pursue that are just critical. And so, making sure that we're allocating those resources in the right way to promote habitat and conserve, just kind of like these broader ecosystems. We understand as hunters that that's, critical for maintaining those game populations that we rely on.
Yeah. And if the agencies have to sink money into endangered species work, those are dollars that are not going towards, fishing game. Maybe that we would hope they're spending more active time restoring for the things we're particularly interested in too. So, it seems like if that could ever pass, that would be a massive funding boost for these agencies to do important stuff that helps, whether you like butterflies or big whitetail bucks, it's gonna be a good thing. Chris, to your point though, one thing I'm curious, like when it comes to state budgets and the funding that, that Michigan gets or Massachusetts gets, where do we come in? What's the you mentioned there's a little bit of an opportunity there. I honestly don't really know how. How would I do that? How might I be able to influence that side of things in my home state?
Sure. So every state has a slightly different budget process, but typically the governor is going to have their sort of version of the budget, and that's oftentimes a place where the public can engage. So, like for instance, I'll give you a local situation example. There is an instance where state agency might give licenses, free licenses to senior citizens or to people with certain physical handicaps or something along those lines. When they give those free licenses, those are, of course, coming out of the budget of the state agency. They can't count on the money that would be generated from those licenses. So there are some efforts in some states to go to the state legislature or to go to the governor and ask, hey, can we get compensated for these licenses? It's going to be maybe up to upwards of $1 million, depending on the population, maybe even more. And so having sort of pressure from the hunting and fishing community to sort of say, hey, Governor, can you reimburse these licenses or fully fund this land acquisition fund or set aside a budget, like is the case in a situation in Ohio right now, set aside a certain chunk of money to allow for a very large land acquisition that is on the table right now. So the public can engage in that process and pressure the governor's office, pressure state lawmakers to sort of prioritize issues that are important to us. And yeah, it's not as sexy, or it might not be as like motivational in terms of like the charge to take action as like a threatening issue or piece of legislation that might take away certain opportunities, for instance. But it's an important step in the process.
So one thing that I've always been kind of, I don't know, surprised by or disappointed in has been, and maybe this is just what I see in my own little world, so maybe this isn't the case everywhere, but it seems like anytime I see Michigan, any talk in my state or some of the other states I've spent time in, when they start talking about raising license costs, people just throw an absolute fit and get so upset and say, how dare you raise my license from $10 to $15 or $20 to $23 or whatever it might be. And I've always thought, like, gosh, like it's a bargain as it is, whether you're paying $10 for a hunting license or $50 for a hunting license or $150 for a hunting license. What we get to do out there, the protein we get to bring home, the experience we get to have, I mean, I would pay a lot of money for that. And then it goes to such an amazing cause. It goes to perpetuating these things that we care so much about. Again, I would donate a lot of money to make sure that's the case. And I know there's a lot of other people who love these things just as much as we do. Why do people get in such a hissy fit about a $10 fee increase or $30 fee increase or whatever it is? Is that, am I just seeing that uniquely, or is that like every state, everyone kind of has that loud, I don't know if it's a minority or majority or whatever it is, but is that changing? Is that going to have to change to deal with these budget issues, Chris?
That is not a unique situation. We hear and feel and experience that everywhere. And I think in part, it is something that a lot of state agencies have sort of sowed that reality, unfortunately. And they did that because of the separation between the state agency, or at least more importantly, the people who work there and the constituents. We've talked about that. You and I have talked about this before. You know, you're working for Wildlife Tour, created this opportunity where a bunch of people got to meet a large number of state employees who came out on their day off. Some of them were on the clock and work side by side. And just the humanization that occurred in that moment was huge, because it just built relationships. And when you recognize that these people are dedicated, the vast majority of these people are dedicated civil servants who aren't just serving the people of the state or the Commonwealth, but they're also serving the wildlife, like professionally, and in many cases at a pretty significant sacrifice. And what I think what's important, and as I've come to do this job and just work in so many different states and meet so many different people, is for the vast majority, we have some great state employees. And I think if people listened and understood and had that better connection with their state agencies and what they're trying to accomplish and the challenges that they face, managing budgets, managing the the politics at the state house. I think they'd be a bit more understanding to the need of increases in small increases or incremental increases in license fees. Because to your point, like we do get some pretty great like life altering experiences out of these opportunities.
Yeah. I'd love to take a look at what the average American spends a year on coffee or something like that. Like, would you be willing to, maybe not coffee because people need their coffee, but fast food or whatever, the amount of money we spend on something trivial that really doesn't matter all that much. I'm sure it outweighs what we spend on hunting licenses by leaps and bounds. So we can spend that money. If we can spend that money on a Starbucks, we can certainly spend that money on a deer hunting license or whatever it is that helps, the thing we love more than anything else continue. I don't know. Devin, do you feel, I'm sure you're feeling some of that out west too.
Yeah, but I will say, in New Mexico, we had SB5 last year, moved through the state legislature, and that was a big bill that had a few different angles to it, but one of them was a significant increase in fees kind of across the board. It had been over 20 years, and the agency was really like desperate at this point. It had kind of reached critical point where they had to do something. So this fee increase was, I would say, it's pretty well received generally. I mean, I think you're always going to have that contingent that is going to resist any type of fee increase. But I think hunters recognize like, okay, it's been the same for a very long time. There's no, staggering increase with inflation. Everything else is going up, but my hunting fees have been the same. And so that bill was actually coupled with a commission reform bill. And that's just like a whole another can of worms quagmire. I think that, we will probably see more of next year, kind of general efforts to reform game commissions. But, I was enthusiastic and optimistic at the response in New Mexico regarding fees. And I think I've seen in a couple instances there, maybe a slightly more willingness to just understanding that like, this has got to happen one way or another. And hunters just kind of with pride shouldering that burden, but it's certainly not everyone marching in that same direction. So I think there's a lot of education that comes in there as well.
Yeah. Okay. So keeping the ball in your court, Devin, what might be the first issue or challenge or opportunity that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I want to kind of dovetail off of what Chris said. And, I think the big one that we're always looking at that I think when you look at really what impacts hunting and fishing at a grand scale, it's always, the encroaching development, industrialization, sprawl. Like these are these big, broad themes. But, when we're talking about how that impacts us, I think just looking at, maybe a subset of that conservation funding is related to connectivity and how that plays out. There is funding at the federal level, but, it kind of remains to be seen what happens next year if we're going to have, the Wildlife Crossings pilot program get, reauthorized, or if we're going to get more funding for like fish passage and projects of that nature through like NOAA or Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I think there's these federal big buckets of funding that we're going to need to stay engaged and really be advocating kind of across the board, across the nation for getting these projects funded, because they're just very easy wins that everyone should be able to agree on. I mean, particularly when we're talking about wildlife crossing projects, there's a great public safety component. You can really relate this to people that are not in the traditional hunting and fishing space. And I think you can build really large, broad tents to accomplish these shared objectives. And, I've worked on a wildlife crossing project in Southern California, the I-8 Peninsular Bighorn Sheep Crossing Project. And I will tell you, it is just a tremendous amount of legwork to stand these things up. And it starts at the state level. And so when we're talking about that funding, we need to be making sure that we're advocating for those budgets for these state agencies to be able to do the on-the-ground work, the callers, the data collection, because that is what informs these projects. And that those are like the major impediments to getting these broader connectivity efforts funded. So just building on Chris's point there, when we're making those cases, and I think the way we can make those cases is just by building that relationship with your, representative in your district, right? Because then they're going to take that when it comes time to vote on the governor's budget. They're going to hopefully be, sharing what they're hearing from constituents. And so, how you engage is at that ground level, making sure that you do have a relationship with your representative at the state level and, of course, the federal level as well. But making those, priorities clear from the beginning and then emphasizing them throughout the process. Just hopping on the phone, hey, just want you to know, and I really care about hunting, fishing, land access, connectivity. Really want you to prioritize this when it comes time to appropriate funds at the legislature. And so I think, if we can bolster some of that funding at the state level and keep some of these connectivity and wildlife crossing projects and fish passage projects coming, I think we're going to be able to weather the storm, whether or not at the federal level, if funding ends up getting a cut. Hopefully we can make it back up at the state level, or, we can double down and really just communicate the importance of that at the federal level as well.
So I sense that the whole idea of wildlife crossing projects and things like that maybe gets talked about a little bit more out west, but I wonder if the folks on the east part of the eastern side of the country maybe just aren't quite as familiar with why this is needed or what this looks like. Can you expand a little bit on that, Devin, just explaining, what are these projects actually tackling? What are they actually doing on the ground? Why is this actually important? I think when people understand it, it's like, oh yeah, this makes a ton of sense. But I'm not sure all that many people truly understand what's happening.
Yeah. So I think to break it down for a lot of, particularly for big game species, out west, is there's just a lot of seasonal migrations and movement required to access that habitat. I mean, a lot of it's related to water, but it's also, winter range and making sure that you have that forage available across kind of like broader swaths of land. And that's going through public, private, and you got, major 8-lane interstates that have been put up in between, where traditional migration routes were. And so, part of it is just trying to address, declining deer herds, and the number of big game animals that are just hitting cars, every year is astounding. And so, that seems like a very easy win for motorists, because you have fatalities all the time. You've got a huge cost to society just to deal with collisions relating to wildlife. And a risk to just the general people on the roads. But also when we're looking at making sure that wildlife can adapt to changing pressures. So whether that's development, whether that's related to changing conditions on the ground with forage, with invasive species, availability of water, having connectivity between these various landscapes, public land, private land, is really critical for those species to be able to adapt. And I think to distribute pressure even from a hunting perspective, to make sure that animals are not just going to pool up on private land in some of these areas where you have higher pressure. And so, the one example I'll give you in sort of the microcosm there for the bighorn sheep crossing project that we're working on is, you've got sheep that come in and they actually have their lambs in between 2 lanes of freeway, and they come back and forth all the time because we built a major thoroughfare through this long-standing movement route where the sheep move to kind of access water and forage at different times of the year. And so you just have a bunch of sheep that are getting hit all the time, ewes, lambs, rams, and this is something that we have the collar data. So since all that infrastructure was done, now we've been able to secure funding at the state level for the planning and design, which there's a huge amount that goes into permitting and designing these structures. And that's where a lot of the cost comes from. And then hopefully you'll move into implementation soon. But you use directional fencing to funnel wildlife over a crossing structure. so that they're, moving and crossing over a freeway at a safe point, and we're not having those collisions anymore.
I was just going to say that work is taking place in the east as well. How it looks is a lot different. We might not have the big dramatic overpasses or wildlife overpasses. It can be achieved through directional fences, culverts. It's amazing what a whitetail will tolerate in terms of going through a tiny little place, and other critters for sure. So we've done a lot of work in the Mid-Atlantic, the Northeast, related to wildlife crossings, habitat connectivity, and we've been trying to take a holistic approach. Obviously, big game animals are something that naturally is interesting to our membership, but also fish passages, amphibians, and other types of wildlife. So there is an appetite for here in the East, and we're trying to find those and support not just legislation that makes sense, but we've also been trying to support research and research funding for that to try to figure out where the best places are.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff, and as you alluded to, Devin, increasingly important given the sprawl, given the development everywhere. Like habitat is just getting increasingly fragmented, broken up into smaller and smaller pieces. Movements are blocked. It's so important and fascinating. If anyone is interested in learning more, there's a great book called Crossings by Ben Goldfarb. Highly recommend it. All about this stuff. Another really neat thing, and you guys can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that my sense is accurate, which is that funding and work and effort behind these wildlife crossing projects, whether it's research or actual building these structures, it's got pretty bipartisan support. This is something that's not just supported by traditional greeny environmental groups. This is something that Republicans are getting behind, and rural landowners are getting behind, and farming families, different folks like that. This is a win for a lot of different people. Like you said, there's the whole thing with just cars and safety, right? This is just an issue that impacts everyday people too. So there's a pretty big tent that can get behind this when so many things seem fractured by partisanship, whether it be on the state level or federal level. In a kind of world right now where it seems like a lot of this stuff's getting smoked on funding. This might be one of those unique places where we can get support from both sides of the aisle from all sorts of different types of folks, right?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree. And I think one piece that I like to point to is Secretarial Order 3362, which came out during the first Trump administration, which prioritizes big game migration corridors and winter range. And that has helped, I think, particularly with the partnership at the state level and state wildlife action plans, and those two kind of prioritizing the importance of understanding where we need to make these investments. SO 3362 has helped to channel a huge amount of funding and work into on the ground projects, whether it's fence removals or bitter brush plantings, and like that's the other piece of that connectivity puzzle that I always want to make sure that we don't forget and that we advocate for, and that is a huge part of BHA's work, is making sure that there is that funding to do the work on the ground that is critical to making sure we can have a wildlife crossing structure and we can have public land, but if it's all cheatgrass and all the valuable forage and everything is burned out and been replaced, then it's really not serving that function. And SO 3362 has helped to funnel a huge amount of funding into that type of work that BHA and our partner organizations have done, and a huge amount of volunteers been able to participate in as well.
I might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, or at least in my initial thought of how this might all go. But both of you have talked about the importance of advocating at the state level for some of this funding and some of these projects. And we spend a pretty decent amount of time, we have spent a decent amount of time over past years in podcasts talking about advocating at a federal level. Me and Cal just had a great conversation earlier this year all about that, how to become a more effective citizen advocate, developing relationships with your senators or your representative, or doing these different things on the federal level. But is there anything unique to operating at the state level? I'll be honest, I've not done a good job of being in touch with my state representative. I'm in touch with my federal, but like on the state side, or having a relationship with your game commission or anything like that. What are some of the unique things we should be thinking about when trying to operate there? And I know you spoke a little bit to this, Chris, but I'd love a little bit more tactically. If either one of you could expand on the unique pressure points or leverage opportunities, or the unique sides of developing influence within the state structure, whether it be on the fishing game side or state funding, et cetera. Chris, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. I mean, I would say the first step is to understand what type of cycle your state operates on, how the state legislature works. Is it a short-term, few month session that most of the business gets taken care of in that short window of time? Is it a 2-year cycle like some states have? Once you sort of can identify that, then the timetable your state electeds are going to be working on. And from there, you can kind of find out when the best time you might, or how you might want to approach that lawmaker to find, to open up the lines of communication. So I think that's an important step, just to sort of get a sense of, all right, like I've got a short window of time, I need to get their attention. And that might change your tactics. If you've got a little bit longer period of time to work with, then you can do a little bit more kind of relationship building and take a more tactful approach to maybe thank that person for some work they did on an issue that, that was important to you in another session, and use that as an opportunity to start a dialogue on, what's important to you in this next, or in the current session. I think those types of things, building that relationship, is so critical. And the states in which we are most effective as a grassroots organization is one where we have a steady presence, not just around like the key issues, or like the real sort of important issues, but a lot of different issues, just so we can establish a relationship, a rapport with state officials, lawmakers. I think that is really, really important. We have a couple, I'm thinking of a few people, a few members that make an annual appointment. They just sometimes that takes place at a local coffee shop because they're members of the community. Sometimes it's a trip down to the state house, and sometimes it's just a conversation with an aide or an assistant. But it's something they do on an annual basis, and that pays dividends for us as an organization, for them as a constituent, and at the same time, it's good for the elected official as well, because they get a sense of what's happening out there that they wouldn't otherwise get, because the reality is they are dealing with probably a lot of different issues, a lot of different constituents, a lot of different bills, a state like Michigan, a state like Massachusetts, a state like California. There are a lot of bills, and there's a lot of passion behind those bills. So we got to keep that in mind and recognize that we're fighting for time, and we have to be respectful of that, and be constructive when we have those opportunities.
Yeah. Would you add anything, Devin?
I think that was really well put. The only thing I'd add is just these legislators are far more accessible than you would imagine, and they don't often hear from their constituents, and so just don't undervalue your voice there. And I think reaching out and developing that relationship, you can have a conversation that can help to influence their perspective. And hearing from 3, 4, 5 constituents on an issue in many cases and in many states is significant. So, I think particularly at the state level, like your voice can really carry, maybe even a little bit farther.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I mean, we've probably all been in hearings. I mean, I've been in public hearings, whether they be a state commission on a particular series. They're handling a series of bills, or like a regulatory hearing at a Fish and Wildlife Board or something. I've been in the room where I've seen a single voice completely shift the outcome of a decision. And I always try to impress that reality to people. Like, your voice can and will make a difference so often.
Well, I think an important thing to remember is that in the case of most of these people making these decisions, placing these votes, they don't have a firsthand understanding of any of this. They're simply taking some, talking points from somebody else who got them from somebody else who got them from somebody else and said, hey, just say this or just make this vote because it fits this narrative or it's the thing. They don't have any kind of real firsthand perspective and or thoughts for a different point of view. So if you can be that, if you can simply be a real resource, you can really help these people, especially if you start, weeks or months or years ahead of a key inflection point. And then when there is a major issue and they are faced with an important decision, they now know, Chris from down the road, or Chris that stops in once a year to talk about hunting and fishing issues, he's actually someone who probably has a perspective that could help me make this decision and be a little bit more informed. That's a huge thing. That's a huge thing. So I think we need to remember that, to your point, Devin, we can make a difference. They're accessible and probably in many cases open to other ideas. So continuing down the line, Chris, what's your next big one?
Another big one, I think, would be public land management. Just, again, kind of keeping it to the state level. So state forest, wildlife management areas, we've seen a lot of new voices coming into the conversation when it comes to the management of these lands. There's, in a lot of eastern states, for instance, there's been a push to establish these things that are oftentimes referred to as old growth reserves, essentially creating stands of wildlife management areas or state forests that do not get touched in terms of habitat management or wildlife management for wildlife management purposes. And in many cases, they go so far as to trying to take management control, sole management control away from the state agency, and create new commissions and boards to manage these areas if this was to come to pass. Those types of initiatives, especially as they relate to lands that were intentionally purchased for the purpose of hunting, fishing, and wildlife habitat, is definitely concerning to us. And they have evolved their messaging for these things to include things like biodiversity and climate change and carbon sequestration, and so just to what we were just talking about, these are things that might be on the radar for some of these state officials. They might not have a full grasp of all the concepts and how it all sort of plays out and what the management charge of these lands are. So it requires a very deliberate approach when it comes to sort of educating lawmakers around these subjects. And we have to be very clear and make the distinction of why these lands and the work that the state agencies are doing in order to maintain certain types of habitat, whether it be early successional or mature types of forest, whatever it might be. So it really creates these really challenging situations, because even in some of these situations, they've called for the exclusion of hunters and anglers, not just from the conversation and the management, but potentially from the actual areas themselves. And that's just one example of like a land management type of scenario. There's also issues with the management as it relates to other forms of recreation, and whether that might be trail building or things along those lines. And these all have impacts on on wildlife. They all have impacts on opportunity. They could have impact on access. So land management issues at the state level is something that we definitely are watching, and the challenges and the situations really change from state to state. So, again, it's one of those hyper local type of issues sometimes.
Okay, so there's state level public land type management processes, and then there's the federal kind of corollary, which would be like resource management plans or national forest management plans, whatever it might be. Um, how should citizens engage on those? What's the I would imagine it's an agency by agency program, but can you talk to us a little bit about how we might be able to figure out the right times to engage on those things, how to engage on those things? Like you said, Chris, a lot of this stuff's complicated. It's really easy to say, don't sell public lands. That's a very simple, easy to understand narrative, easy to call someone and say, don't sell my public lands. It's much harder to have a clear, nuanced understanding of something like, hey, how do we manage these things best? Like even the example you brought up is complicated and complex, right? It's like, well, yeah, we need to have actively managed forests in some places, but maybe there are some places that should be in a more mature state. And maybe there are some places there should be logging, and maybe there are some places that shouldn't have logging, and maybe there are some places that should be protected in X way, and there's other places that should be in Y way. Right? This is like there's a lot of gray areas when it comes to management and priorities and all of that. So how do you go about influencing any of that?
Well, when there's public hearings around the management of properties or the establishment of a management plan that's going to be used to manage the next, say, decade or whatever, like it might not be, it's not like an issue like selling off of public lands, like you mentioned. It's an issue that is going to have a long-term impact, but it might not draw the same attention. And so it's just a matter of really kind of plugging in to the state agencies, plugging in to organization like BHA who's watching and engaged in these things, or other NGO, and so that when there is a call to action, when there is a public hearing, when there is a need to sort of reach out and make a connection to a decision maker, that those voices can come out. This is, it's the thing we always kind of come back to is that there is a responsibility for us as hunters and anglers to sort of stay abreast of all this information, to continue to learn. I think it also helps us when we're in the field, and doing what we love most. But it also makes us just a more rounded conservationist. And so it's just a matter of sort of staying in touch with these things, raising your voice when needed. This is not something that typically happens on an annual basis in terms of management plans. However, there is legislation sometimes that can usurp the management plans, like the forest reserve type of scenario that I just laid out. So it's it is a lot to sort of stay on top of, and that's why I think it's sort of self-serving a little bit to sort of mention it, but to plug into plug into conservation organizations, just so someone else is also keeping an eye on this kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I got to believe, for some people, this is going to be on a case by case basis, but there's some people, especially I think national forests or big state forests, this is easier to think about when you might live somewhere where, hey, like my entirety of my outdoor access and my public access is dependent on the Hiawatha National Forest or the whatever Traverse City State Forest or the national, Gallatin National Forest in Montana, whatever it is. Like if there's a place that's near and dear to your heart and to your activities, it probably does make sense to start to understand, when do these resource management plans or forest management plans start, when do they start being debated, discussed, worked on? Who do you need to know to be, heard on those things? What's the line? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I think that's true for everything we're talking about, but it's definitely true when it comes to these management plans. Right?
Yeah, and I'll say too, there's a bit of responsibility that does fall on the state agencies or the land management organization, whether it's like your state forest entity or conservation department, however it works for your particular state. While they're mandated to sort of say that they're gonna, like, their management plan is up for conversation, for public comment, they also have to be better about explaining the why they're doing things. And because so oftentimes, let's take like an instance where there might be a WMA that at one point in time in the history of this say forest, it might have been like a pine barrens type of habitat. And so the state might go and take effort, maybe do a controlled burn and do some different habitat work to restore that pine barrens. But if they don't articulate sort of the why, the process, what they're doing, other members of the community, when they visit these locations that are important to many people, not just hunters and anglers, they might not be ready for what they see. The trucks, the saws, the fire, the smoke, all that sort of stuff. Because sometimes these projects take a long time. And if they don't articulate what they're trying to achieve and the steps that are required to get to that objective, then, we're left kind of having to sort of, have a little bit tougher uphill battle, if you will. So I think it's important to sort of, ask our state agencies to sort of explain better and to do a little bit more outward work publicly as to what they're trying to achieve and how they plan on doing.
Yeah. With public land being such a massive part of the landscape out west, Devin, I got to imagine this whole management side of things is a big part of your world. Would you have anything to add?
Yeah. To build on those great points Chris made, I think, and trying to look ahead a little bit about, into the crystal ball of what we're, potentially going to be seeing, I think there are some big common opportunities, besides trying to track and understand what's happening, with the resource management planning process in your particular area. There's some big national initiatives that we're grappling with. One of those being, the repeal of the roadless rule. Another one, just kind of broader again in that same sort of vein, is looking at travel management and how we might see some big changes and movement there on how we manage motorized use in national forests, and these are pretty unwieldy when you try to think about it at the grand scale for the nation, and for an individual, kind of as you asked Mark, like, so how do you weigh in here? What's your voice? What's your role? What we have been doing is soliciting stories from our membership and our constituents in these particular areas. So we've overlaid some GIS resources, where what's a roadless area, and trying to break down some of that just to, so when you're doing your e-scouting or when you're, looking at where you typically hunt, you can say, I have a personal story here. And I think that is the lane that we're really encouraging folks to try and lean into is the power of like your own story, your own pictures, your own videos from these inventory roadless areas. Your stories being out there walking, 5 miles into the backcountry, whatever it is, and having some dude on his e-bike zip by in a non-motorized area. And e-bikes is a whole separate one. We can give you 1,000 things to look at, but I'll try not to go down too many rabbit holes. I just think that it's going to be really important for folks to, one, be tracking those timelines. So like paying attention to your conservation organizations that are tracking these things. Roadless, we're probably going to see a comment opportunity sometime around March or in the springtime, and travel management might be a little bit later in the year, maybe around August. But weighing in with your personal connection to the land, the big bull that you killed, or whatever it is that you like to do out on those public lands, those are the narratives that I think will have the most weight. And being in this constituency of hunters and anglers, we are uniquely positioned right now to be able to influence policy by just telling it how it is and saying, this is where I go hunt and fish. This is the value that I see in these lands. This is why I want to be providing this context for legislators so that they understand when they're making these big decisions that they can connect it to the ground, to the uses. And so I think that's the strategy there, right? That's how you can kind of make your voice carry a little bit further and influence some of these bigger, burlier, unwieldy land management type decisions.
Yeah. You mentioned the travel management plan situation. I think a lot of folks now understand what the roadless rule is and what's going on with that. I don't think as many people know about the travel management plan, possible update or rollback, whatever that's going to be. Can you give folks a quick rundown of what that might mean, what that could lead to, why that's worth paying attention to?
Yeah, so this one is kind of developing. We've seen some comments from the administration that they're going to be looking to basically modify or roll back the 2005 travel management rule. And so what this basically is, to break it down, is you have various areas in your forests and public lands that are designated as motorized, non-motorized. You've got specific regulations on trails and what uses are allowed and what aren't. I think that this has helped to balance some of those multiple uses, right? BHA and many conservation organizations we've worked with have a nuanced perspective there, right? There's a time and place for motorized access, and that's fantastic, and we use that time and place for OHVs, and those are fun to get on. But there's also the importance and the significance of those backcountry areas that do require a little bit more respect and work to get to and to appreciate. And so what we're seeing is an indication that there's going to be some shifts there, and potentially some expansion of motorized access into some of these previously non-motorized areas. And the reason why that's significant is, one, backcountry wouldn't be backcountry, but you just drive in there and park. So just core to the ethos of what BHA is about finding that solace and getting out there and really putting the work in. But the other impact there is, when we increase pressure and access and make it easier to access some of these more remote areas, we're likely to see increased negative impacts on our game species. And just punching roads into the backcountry, there are, and increasing motorized access into the backcountry, there are all sorts of trickle down impacts there for that have been well documented for migration, for the health of different herds of elk and deer, and then also sedimentation into streams for fisheries and risk of fires as people are driving. Fires are more likely to start near roads, so there's all these different angles there, and again, I think We'll see what comes of this, but I think the opportunity is there to work with a broad variety of stakeholders. There's a number of kind of motorized recreation groups that have come out opposed to that, because there is a good balance right now, and there are gains and conversations that have been made that are getting people together in a room and understanding, okay, well, where does motorized recreation make sense, and where do we want to limit that? And I think we don't want to throw all that hard work and all those conversations out. And certainly there's probably an opportunity to improve that. We'll, stick our heads in the sand there, but want to make sure that we're not throwing it all away, and that we're working to improve and have those, broad stakeholder driven conversations to make that happen.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like we have time for one last big picture issue or opportunity. And I think that opportunity goes to you, Devin. You've got one more. If you have another one you want to talk about, do we have any final issue or opportunity you want to wrap this up with?
Yeah, we could go on for days. So we'll keep it to your time limit here. I think the one that I'll try to take a bit of a broad brush here, and then we can zero in a bit, but just looking at access, right? We can't hunt and fish if we can't get there and we don't have access. And so I'll give you kind of the land and the water components of that I think we're likely to see a lot of movement. next year in legislatures, particularly at the state level. And that is looking at navigable waters access, stream access, and also corner crossing. So, I think corner crossing being more of a Western issue, I'll just kind of mention briefly that we're already hearing about potential, bills, draft legislation in various states that are following on the heels of the 10th Circuit decision and the decision by the Supreme Court to, basically affirm that 10th Circuit decision. And so now we have great clarity in those 6 states covered by the 10th Circuit, but really a huge portion of the rest of the West and the 9th is kind of remains to be determined. There's a bit of a legal gray area there. And so I think we've seen movement in Montana coming out from the Fish and Wildlife and Park saying it's illegal, we're going to prosecute it, which is a bit of a departure from previous statements. We've seen some statements from Colorado inside the 10th talking about, how it's great, it's legal, but you can't do it on state lands. Wyoming has a bill looking at criminal trespass. Oregon's looking at a bill. And so just flagging that one, that it would be a great issue to stay on top of. It's going to be something that BHA is heavily engaged in, and we're going to continue to work with landowners, with this broad community to ensure that we have access to our public lands and respect for private property. I think this is a common sense one that we really can all agree on and provide some clarity there.
And then the water side you were going to mention?
Yeah, and then on the water side, just over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of movement on navigable waters, and stream access. So New Mexico had some big gains on stream access. California passed a navigable waters, a flooded waters bill that was really important and pro hunting. Oregon just passed a great bill to help streamline the process for determining navigable waters. And I think that we're likely to see some big movement in Colorado and Utah this year as well, where stream access and navigable waters access is not as open, and it's actually really restrictive in Colorado, where there are a number of rivers that you can't float even. So you're not even talking about touching the stream bed. You can't even float through these private property areas where, these are clear, big rivers that have been used for a long time by people to hunt and fish, and they are critical for our access, I think in a number of different states. And so I expect us to be engaging heavily on this as we have in the past, but to see a number of bills and, the right to float through these, major thoroughfares and to be able to fish and hunt them is really critical to the whole public trust doctrine, to, what I would believe, just similar to public lands, that these are essential to kind of our heritage and what it means to be an American is to have access to these lands and waters. And so every state's a little different. We'll see what happens in Colorado and Utah. And I know, Chris, I think there may be, movement as well in the East on this one. So it's one of those issues that does kind of span the nation as well.
Yeah, a lot to digest there. And to this is one of those deals where maybe all of this, I do feel like the homogenization or the nationalization of everything these days leads to us sometimes thinking about conservation at this very federal, national level, right? I mean, like the politics of Michigan versus Florida sometimes don't feel that different when all you're hearing about is what's on, Fox News or CNN, and all they're talking about is the national stuff. And, we're all like virtual neighbors now. So it's easy sometimes to forget about how important some of the state level stuff is, that is far reaching and that does have major implications. Like this water access, like, corner crossings that are all, while it might be a federal debate on many of these things are being handled in the Supreme Court or federal courts farther down, the state is where a lot of the stuff ends up being decided in practice. And that's where we actually can have more impact, maybe, because it's slightly less noisy there. So really, really good reminders on that front for us. I appreciate that. Wrapping things up, I guess. A little bit of a rapid fire, quick set of questions that I would be curious to just get the first things that come off the top of your mind. This could be something that we've already talked about. These might be things that are new that haven't been able to be brought up yet. But I'd like to, with each of you, ask you 3 fast questions, and then we're going to tie this all up and get you guys out and back to your very important jobs. I'll start with you, Devin, since you've got some momentum. You've been talking here a second. First thing, what today gives you the most cause for concern about the future of hunting, fishing, wildlife, and wild places? What's the first thing that's causing you concern, that worries you the most? If there's anything that were to be keeping you up at night, and this could be state level, federal, anything, what's that one thing?
It's the hollowing out of our federal agencies, the lack of funding for those federal agencies, and the real kind of resurgence of the sagebrush rebellion type notion that we should be transferring our federal lands to the states, centralizing, fire management, and taking the role of the federal government that we currently have to manage our public lands, to keep them in public hands according to the multiple use mandate, and that balance. I think that's the one that's keeping me up, and that we're basically siloing these things out and hollowing them out and bringing in more kind of private industry and some of these shared stewardship agreements to really, kind of just reduce the role that the federal government and also the public has in being able to comment and manage those lands.
We should probably take another 30 minutes to unbox that some more. but yes, a lot there. A quick pivot. What's one thing that gives you hope? What's the one thing that encourages you despite all of that?
The thing that gives me hope is just, seeing the amount of people and the bipartisan nature of this issue, the amount of people that came out over the summer opposing the sale of lands, and the kind of the public lands being front and center for a number of different communities and constituencies that maybe didn't previously weigh in there. And I think it's one of the really, it should be and has been one of the few bipartisan issues that we can really lean into. And so I think I continue to hope that public lands and hunting access and angling access, all those, things that fit into the umbrella of public lands continue to be something that is not a partisan issue, that we can build big tents and move forward and keep those public lands in public hands.
All right. And the one single action that you would ask of our listeners over the next 12 months, what's the single most important thing they can do as hunters and anglers and advocates for these things?
The single most important thing would be to develop a relationship with your state and federal members of Congress and members of the state legislature, and tell your stories from those lands that you have. Like, provide your personal, authentic, honest accounts of why these places are important to you, and utilize the tools that BHA has provided and partner organizations have for, framing and particular issues and the nuance and details and data. But to be honest, just tell your story, and that is going to go a lot further than parroting any talking points.
Yeah. All right, Chris, you're up to bat. Single greatest point of concern.
This one's gonna come from the East, and that's relevancy. Our relevancy as hunters and anglers is something that concerns me. Across most of the country, resident license sales are declining, and that decline is most dramatic in the East. And some of the more populated states. And we need to be able to articulate and what our value is to society and why what we do is important, not to us, but to society as a whole. I think that is, I think there aren't as many people who are able to share those experiences in a manner that is going to help the greater hunting and fishing community. So I think we all have to be better at doing that.
Yeah. Okay. greatest cause for hope?
Connection. When Devin and I have the opportunity to travel around a little bit to meet our members of the hunting and fishing community, especially within like the BHA community, and to see the passion and just the broad sets of experiences and the passion that's out there, like that gives me hope that like all of the challenges that we are facing can be met and surpassed. I mean, you've been to Rendezvous, you've been to some of the other events. Like those things, I think, are so critical. We have to connect face to face more often.
Yeah. And what's your call to action?
I gotta say exactly what Devin said. Make a connection to your elected officials, and also just I said it earlier. Let that also include your state fish and wildlife board or your state agency. Develop a relationship more than just sending in your $65 or whatever it is for your annual license. Make that connection. Show up at an event. Support the agency or just learn from the agency, and I think that's gonna help out everybody.
Yeah, so true. Well, Chris, since you're the last one on the line here, you're stuck giving the plug too. Can you tell folks where they can connect with backcountry hunters and anglers, how they can do so? Anything else on that front?
Sure. So, of course, we're on all the social platforms. Our website, backcountryhunters.org. You can find all the stuff that we work on at the state level. We have a monthly sort of column on the website. It also is sort of streamlined for a social media post called the Policy Spotter, State Policy Spotter, where we kind of highlight a handful of state issues that we're working on a monthly basis. Look for those types of things, become a member, support the work that we're doing, attend an event, Habitat Stewardship Project, Pine Night, whatever it is. Take that opportunity to sort of have a face-to-face conversation with someone, you're welcome to be part of this community and to work for public lands, waters, and wildlife.
Yeah, it's a good time too. We've all experienced that, and so was this. So thank you, Devin. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate you guys' time. Thanks for sharing all this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you being a part of this community, and I am wishing you an incredible 2026. Lots of fun times ahead, and plenty more hours on the podcast here, the two of us talking about these wild things that we enjoy so much. So until next time, thanks for being here, and stay wired to hunt.